Greetings, students. I'm Dr. Sadi, your instructor for this course, and we continue our understanding of Module 6 by, covering Chapter 14. And Chapter 14, as you have noticed, is covering the very significant topic of international organizations. Okay, starting with, slide number 2, which is basically talking about the learning objectives. Um, how would I summarize some of the things that we are going to talk about? In terms of the summary, I can say that this chapter and my lectures associated with it is going to cover the intergovernmental organizations, which is, short version of it is IGO. Is that right? So intergovernmental organization. Then it also talks about the trends in the growth of IGOs. Then it also talks about the regional IGOs and global IGOs, so different types of IGOs, okay? And then it also talks about international non-governmental organizations, or INGOs, okay? What those are. And last but not least, in terms of those players at the international scene, is non-state actors in the IR theories. Then in terms of the next slide, continuing with the learning objectives, the idea right here is that after reading the, of course, chapter and listening hopefully to my video lectures, you will be able to understand that what IOs, or international organizations, are all about, and what is their variety, and what type of form they take. We also understand what INGOs are and what are their types and varieties. And next, we also focus on non-state actors, that they could be involved in the whole notion of the global process and globalization, especially since the end of World War II. And last but not least, we would like to evaluate different theoretical aspects in terms of the significance of non-state actors, which have been playing a very important role in international relations in the last few decades. Okay, having said that one, let's start by talking a little bit about the IGOs. Well, they have been around the world, are approximately about 250, is that right? They're not exactly those numbers, but I thought if I make it to be nice round numbers, you would remember them better, is that right? About 250 IGOs exist as early as the beginning of this decade, 2020s, is that right? So it is generally agreed that what makes an IGO, or at least 3 different conditions. Now, what are those conditions? And we want those conditions because we want to make sure that we separate IGOs from what? From other type of actors involved in the international scene. So the first condition is there should be at least 2 or more states members of this, or participant in this organization. 2, there should be some sense of permanency. Is that right? And that means that there should be, we assume there would be some kind of charter or some kind of constitution of this organization. So it's not like, oh yeah, well, we talked about something, and next time, who knows, if you're gonna, follow what we talked about before. So that, documentation in form of a charter, like UN has a charter, is that right? That would give it a sense of permanency, Then the third condition is regular meetings. What's the benefit of an organization that never meets? Okay, there is no benefit to that. So in that regard, by meeting on a regular basis, it's participating on what? It's participating in decision making. All right, having said that one, now, what can we say in terms of the trend in growth? I guess that's one of the things that has been surprising a lot of people. We can say that since the, beginning of the last century, so the last 2 centuries basically, these organizations, these IGOs have been growing constantly and in a very significant way. Now, notice that in one of my, slides, slide number 5, I actually found a nice little, diagram for you showing how they have been growing in comparison to some of the other organizations. So that's important. Interesting enough, since the end of the Cold War, okay, and here we're talking about obviously the end of 1980s and beginning of 1990s, guess what? Their numbers not only hasn't increased, but has fallen a little bit. Okay, so people have come up with different reasons for that one. Like, oh, okay, well, the numbers has decreased because many of them were associated somehow with the Cold War environment. And some people say, no, well, I mean, it has naturally increased because they were involved in certain function, and those functions they still exist. So there's no reason to increase anymore. And sometimes it's fallen because there are some duplication among their activities and everything, and maybe the ones that are not so important, they kind of disappear. All right, so there are a lot of different things that they say, but the interesting part of it is all these different explanations. Some people, they say, well, it has something to do with the process of globalization too. So anyway, I just wanted you to have heard different point of views. I don't want my students to just hear one point of view and this is the one and only one and this is right and everybody else is wrong. No, this is social sciences, and there are a lot of different there are a lot of different explanations. Okay, now in terms of the IGOs, I guess one of the most important things we should mention is IGOs were not always developed as a result of, oh, there's a war or something to do with war and peace. Sometimes they're developed because there is a need for it. There is a need for it, so it's established. And we can here go back to, for example, the period of both 19th, 20th century and, continue with our century, that we see that the need for cooperation, sometimes the need for cooperation on a particular issue or topic or area or whatever becomes a driving force. So in that regard, we can say in the modern period, the first IGO was the Central Commission for the Navigation of the Rhine. Okay, so the six basically the Rhine countries, and here we go. The River Rhine is running in Europe, is that right? From Switzerland and Liechtenstein and Austria and Germany and France and the Netherlands, because the Rhine goes over there. The Rhine goes over there. And it's the Rhine goes over there basically because if you think about it in terms of geographic, physical aspect of it. How does the water move? Water moves in basically the lowest resistant area, and that basically shows the lowest resistant area from a higher area in Europe, which are the more mountainous area, to the lower areas, which are next to the what? Next to the sea. Okay, so it doesn't take an Einstein to figure it out. Now, when was it established? In 1815. Now, why was it established? It was established because that river has played such an important role in terms of transportation and navigations and even source of water and everything for many of these countries, that they thought, what, we need a sense of order. So people, they do not run to each other. People will be using it in a good way, not doing this, not doing that. So that's why they came up with that one and established it, and it's still going on, believe it or not. Okay, so. In that regard, we can say that the commission came to existence for a functional purpose and still continues to perform that function. All right. One of the other things that I need to mention is sometimes these functions, they happen at the regional level. And in fact, many times at the regional level, the success kind of like what they call, it's the name of the process, they call it spills over to a different level. So success at the regional level leads into or spills over to the global level. Now let me give you a real concrete example of that, because sometimes if you talk too much abstract, you might not remember it. Okay, the best example of this one happened actually in Europe, because it's easy and it's a modern one, so you would remember. It's the European Coal and Steel Commission, which is also known as ECSC. It was established by the Treaty of Paris in 1951. Basically, 6 countries, they came together. Now, what are these 6 countries? The Benelux countries plus Germany, France, and Italy. Now, you say, what are the Benelux countries? Belgium, Netherlands, and Luxembourg. Okay? Now, I would say, and this is unfortunately one of the things that your book doesn't talk about, but I usually provide, these extra informations to make sure that things, they glue together better and you understand a little bit better. Very frankly, the 3 Benelux countries are like the engine of growth for that. Why? Because they started cooperating with one another as early as 1922. They had a Benelux countries, agreement. And I think for many interesting reasons, that had become like a, role model for the bigger organization, which was this ECSC. And you might say, why, European coal and steel, You know why? Because coal and steel are, 2 major topics for any industrial countries. These are countries that they use the, coal for energy, is that right? Cheap energy, and steel. You make a lot of stuff from steel. You make, with steel, you make things from like needles that, people they use to, sew things, all the way to what? Tanks and ships and, cars and everything else. So steel is very, very important from an industrial perspective. And then in that regard, we see that, as I mentioned before, the success of this one was hoped to spill over to the international ones. Now, one of the other things that I need to mention is that many times these organizations, they start, instead of having just like one function, like, oh, let's focus only on coal and steel, they end up having multiple functions. Like the success of, ECSC led into the Europeans, they start cooperating on other topics. And they said, you know what, maybe we should also cooperate on, issues associated with atomic energy. So then they established Euratom. Is that right? Or let's do a little bit more about trade, and they established European Economic Community. You see what I mean? So this is very, very interesting because so success in one area led them to work together on another area. In other words, it's deepening their relationship. Okay, that's very important. If you're trying to avoid war, there are two general strategies. One general strategy is keep people separate, but with the growth of international economy, people, they need each other. Every country is focusing on something different. Is that right? Isn't that what David Ricardo was talking about? Comparative advantage. Is that right? Okay. So then another strategy is to create peace, bring people together and let them to cooperate on together. And these are basically the notions that this one, this idea is coming from. So by 1957, what they call the Treaty of Rome, is that right? ECSC, EEC, European Economic Community, and Euratom were kind of merged into a new entity, European Community. You see what I mean? European Communities was established, and this was presenting from a perspective of, international relations, professors, something called neo-functionalism. Is that right? That the cooperation is not just functional on one thing. The cooperation is becoming more and more about more than just economic, adjustment of our policies. They're actually adjusting some of their political policies and everything. Okay? So that's what they said. So there was a very, very optimistic perspective in that regard. All right. So in that regard, we can also say that the global functional, IGOs, they have had the whole notion that the logical, answer for them was institutionalizing those cooperation in for a utilitarian purpose. Remember what I said about the, River Rhine? Is that right? So those 6 countries, they came together because they just wanted to focus on navigation in the river that all 6 of them are using. From the top, is that right? And the highest areas and the, mountains, or higher grounds, better to say, is that right? Going all the way to the lower one. So in that regard, that trend, these tough trends at a regional level has been what leading into the global trend. And it's also important to mention that many of these advancements, very frankly, between us, has been the result of the technological development. Technology has been a very important factor, guys. Is that right? Like, for example, I know that, maybe you don't identify with some of these, but when, in the 19th century, a telegraph was, invented, the importance of how to send a message. So you do not need to give a letter to a horse, rider that from here, or a carriage rider, from here, take it somewhere else. Here we go. You're going over there, and you have something like a Morse code or something, use a telegram, and you can send the same message so much faster than, a horseman takes from one place to another one. Is that right? And also, the whole notion of the, postage and the postage service and the Universal Postal Union. So in 1865, the ITU, which stands for International Telegraph Union, was what? Established to kind of coordinate the activities of the states in terms of telegram. So, because every state obviously would, control the behavior of their own population and agencies or something in terms of telegrams within the country. But what about if a telegram from one country is supposed to go to somewhere else? Let's say somebody wants to send a message to their friend that, oh, by the way, I'm going to be coming over there. So they would have an idea. Is that right? Now, nowadays, we take it for granted. How many of us are using Telegram? Is that right? I don't think there are very many. There are still some agencies doing it for official purposes or something, but most people, they're just carrying their phone, is that right? And the phone is a smartphone and they send a text message, here we go. So, but also Universal Postal Union still, by the way, is still going on too. And that one, as I think I mentioned, was established in 1874. And again, it shows how technology impacts international relations. Now, one of the things that I wanted to mention is about these multi-purpose IGOs, okay? And I should say that there are 3 historical examples of these organizations that have been established. And they're still functioning, well, 2 of them are functioning. Okay, one was League of Nations. If you remember from what we talked about before, League of Nations was established right after World War I. So it was established officially in 1920. It had a charter, this and that, etc., but it has some deficiencies, and unfortunately, if you remember, those deficiencies, they led into its failure, and basically what? It was not able to prevent the start of World War II. So by the time World War II started, League went out of business, okay? And then when World War II finished, people, they said, you know what? There was some advantage of having that League of Nations, Let's have another organization that provide some of the services that League did, and maybe it will be acting even better, and we give it a little bit more little bit more power. Is that right? To coordinate our relationships and everything, not to give it sovereignty completely, but to do that. So, and that was United Nations, which was established in 1945. And then we can say that, as your text was talking about, there is also an organization called Organization of Islamic Cooperation. For short, they call it OIC. Is that right? This one established in 1969. As of now, it has 57 members. Is that right? And it's basically the members, obviously, you have to be a country that is like majority Muslim, or at least Muslims are, significant percentage of the population and everything. So it does some work and is I guess in that regard, is the second largest IGO after United Nations. However, when you compare what it does in theory into what it does in practice, one of the very well-known scholars of what we call MENA, Middle East and North African area, professor by the name of Professor Mamoun Al-Abbasi, he has said something, and as I mentioned, he's an analyst in that regard. He says that OIC's rhetoric rarely translates into actions on the ground. In other words, what is he saying? He's saying that there is a gap between what they say and what they do. All right. You're not judging anybody, Sometimes they say the same thing about some of the other organizations. Okay. The next thing that we want to talk about is, if you notice, your chapter is talking about the, what they call pressure groups. Okay, which is interesting. I think under pressure groups, they are covering basically what many people, they say INGOs, international non-governmental organization, but based on the information that they have provided, the yearbook of international organizations suggests that there are about 60,000 not-for-profit, they call it not-for-profit, non-profit, is that right, for short, organizations that exist, and there are another 60,000 for-profit organizations, and these enterprises, is that right, they're controlling another 500,000, 500,000 subsidiaries. Interesting. These are very interesting numbers. Okay. Then they're also talking about the international pressure groups have increased from approximately about 1,000 in 1945, basically at the end of World War II, is that right? To nowadays, can you guess? About 60,000. That's a lot of organization. Sure. In other words, it has increased in a matter of almost 7.5 decades, whatever. It has increased by like 60 times, 1,000 to 60,000. All right. Now, many of them, they focus on different type of topics. Some of them, they focus on natural environment, some of them on human rights, some of them on international development. So they have different interests. I'll give you an example. Like, for example, Amnesty International. Okay? I'm sure some of you have heard of it. Is that right? Amnesty International is interested in human rights issues. Another one that a lot of young people know about is what? Greenpeace. Is that right? Greenpeace is focused on what? On environmental issues. So I just wanted to give you a couple of examples. I don't want to bombard you with some, but the book also has a lot more. Then, another topic that they're talking about is what? Multinationals. Okay. Have you heard that concept? Now, multinational, and I wanted to mention this one because I noticed the text has not. The text basically refers to these as MNCs, okay, which is one of the topics that, or better to say, one of the abbreviations for multinationals. So multinational corporation, is that right? So multinational corporation, MNC. You see where I was coming from. I want you to also know that when you're reading the material published by the United Nations and their system about multinational, many times they don't say multinational, they say TNC. T stands for transnational, transnational corporation, so TNC. Now, in the international relations literature, sometimes you also see TNE, transnational, instead of corporation, they say enterprise, okay? Or sometimes people say MNE, multinational enterprise. So these four abbreviations, it refers to four different things, is that right? But guess what? They're basically referring to the same phenomenon, is that right? Multinational corporation. But if I ask you, what's the abbreviation for multinational corporation? Don't say MNE. You have to say MNC. If I say, if I ask you, what does MNE stands for? Then you say multinational enterprise. Is that right? Okay. Or transnational enterprise. If I ask you, what is TNE? Okay. Anyway, just wanted to make sure that you have a knowledge of this one, because I know, unfortunately, all of these things are not covered by your text. All right. One of the other things that you need to know about MNCs is nowadays we have a whole lot of them. We use so many of their products. We use Google. We use Microsoft. We drive a car, is that right? Almost all of these, big car companies are multinational. Use a gas, many of the oil companies are multinational. All right, so, but it's not they've had a modest beginning, and it goes all the way back to 17th and 18th century. Officially, the very first one was the Dutch East India Corporation, which was established in about 17th century, 1600. Is that right? And then, they started growing all the way to World War II. And then after World War II, they started growing like crazy. Okay? So the two aspects of this is, they deal with the economic globalization of the world. All right, so what can we say in that regard? We can say, number one, you have to consider the internationalization of production. Okay, what do I mean by that? Okay, let's say you buy a Ford car, is that right? Or a GM car. Open the hood and look at each one of the parts. So I remember that when I was a graduate student, I suddenly became very, very nationalistic, and I thought, okay, I sold my Toyota Celica and I bought a Ford Fiesta. And I thought, Ford Fiesta, American made. Is that right? A couple of times that car had a lot of problems and everything. And then I took it to the dealership, and I said, okay, I have a problem with this and that. They said, well, we have to wait for these parts to come from Europe. I said, I'm sorry, what? They said, come from Europe. I said, what do you mean by Europe? This is a Ford. He said, yeah, it's a Ford, but not all the parts are made here in the U.S. It's called Ford, Fiesta. And then for a while, it went actually, they didn't even milk that one, and they started making Ford Festiva, and then went back to Fiesta again. And it was a car that, it was like, four-door, and looked like the old Volkswagen, Golf, if you remember. Very much that same similar. It's a type of car that's very popular in Europe. Could get gas mileage, things like that. Very small, so you can park it anywhere. Is that right? I didn't realize that. I thought I was buying a Ford, and here it comes. I have to wait for the parts coming from. Some of them was coming from Spain. Some of them was coming from Portugal. Some were coming from Italy. Some were, and then little by little they started building some of these things in, and this is when I was in Arizona. Is that right? They were building it from Hermosillo, capital of Sonora, province of Mexico. So what I'm trying to tell you is this product really is a combination of all these other products put together. It's not just, oh, wow, it's Ford, it's built in Detroit, Michigan. Is that right? No, those times are gone. And all of the companies are nowadays doing that. The next one is internationalization of a financial transaction. Guess what? there is no international trade happening without the financial part of it. In other words, the person who is selling it wants to make sure they get paid, okay? So there have been a lot of rules and regulation in terms of international banking, this and that, and banks in the world, they have a connection with each other, they establish this and that is very, very important. So these things have led, in fact, into, they are, as a result, basically, this international financial transaction are a result of two other factors themselves. One is the freeing the trade, barriers, because one of the challenges that led to actually World War I and in some ways to World War II as well was there were a lot of trade barriers. Countries were trying to protect themselves from cheaper products coming from neighboring countries or some other place. Is that right? So they started artificially increasing the tariff. Is that right? Tariff, tax on trade. Is that right? So tariffs. So when after World War II, especially in Europe and other parts of the world, they said, you know what, let's decrease this one, become a little bit more friendly toward each other. We cooperate a little bit better too. Guess what? That started freeing the what? More, I guess, Marx would not be happy, is that right? Because it increased international trade and capitalism is growing a little bit more and everything else. The next notion is the general growth of the global economy. So it wasn't just one thing. It was what? A couple of other things happening at the same time, global economy. Now that we talked about the multinationals, I need to tell you something else about these multinationals, and that is how these multinationals, they function. Is that right? Now, I want you to think about this. Every multinational, doesn't matter how, of course, they become multinational when they operate in more than one country. Is that right? That's the first thing that you need to know. The second thing you need to know is that every multinational, regardless of how many countries are involved, they have a country in which that's their headquarters. Is that right? Yes. Ford and GM and a number of other ones, they build, cars here still in Detroit and other places. Is that right? As you know, they have opened up also assembly lines in different states. But the headquarters is in the U.S. Is that right? The same way that you see, for example, the headquarters of, Honda is in Japan. It makes sense. Is that right? The Toyota headquarters is over there. Okay. So when their headquarters is in one country, that becomes their home country. And the countries that they're operating in becomes host country. Home country, host country. Then there is a multinational. Is that right? So what does the multinational do to get their way? They have two strategies. Sometimes they work indirectly, sometimes they work directly. Let's talk first of all indirectly. Indirectly, at home, what they can do is a multinational can ask the home country to, would you please put a little bit pressure on the such and such host country because they're making it so hard for us to sell our products there. Is that right? So they come to Washington and say, could you put a little bit more pressure on Japan? It's so hard for us to sell, for example, Japanese, American cars. Okay? So US, Washington asked, Tokyo, hey, could you relax a little bit, take it easy a little bit? So that would be one way. Another indirect way is that they do indirectly internationally. In this case, for example, multinational, there is the general policy or questions with international organizations. Okay, they say, for example, is this really fair? Isn't it going to be better for the consumers that we bring the tariffs down, or we bring this one down, or we bring that one down? You see what I mean? So it's indirect. What about the direct one? The direct one would be every multinational would try to do what? They try to lobby their own country, their own government. Okay, so they lobby their, that's what we have all these lobbyists in Washington. What do you think they do? They're representing all these different interests, different corporation, different this, different that. All of them, they're trying to put what? More pressure on Washington. So Washington approaches foreign countries that way and it provides them with more, benefits. And also sometimes they do it what? Internationally. Like, for example, they lobby the foreign governments, and the ministries and everything. So I already covered that one. Now what I wanted to say is I wanted to say a few words about the non-state actors in international relation in relationship to what? In relationship to different IR theories. As you know, they're realists. They really do not think very highly, to be honest with you, of IGOs. They say states are the dominant actors. Okay, yeah, we take it. And then IGOs are basically for convenience of states. Because the IGOs are not world government. IGOs are servants of states. Frankly, in this regard, they're right, okay? United Nations on its own cannot do things. The United Nations has to cater to what? to its member states. If the member states want UN to do something, it does it. If it does, they do not want, it doesn't do it, and it looks paralyzed. Okay, so that's an important aspect. And they are very, very, they said that, IGOs, they strictly, or better to say the realists, they've said that strictly intergovernmental organizations, they do not have any sovereignty, Whatever they have is borrowed from their member state. So, and they also say, I'm sorry, not so, but say that the growth of the, IGOs in the 20th century was because they were providing a particular function that states want. If states don't want, it's not going to happen. Now, the neo-realists, however, they have a little bit more positive perspective, and they say that this new, basically neo-realists, or the new breed of the realists, that they came about in 1970s, they started seeing that because there's more IGOs, they seem to be influential, because they provide information, they provide services. And in fact, let me mention a couple of names so you remember these people. Rob Gilpin, is that right? That in 1981 published his work, Ken Walls, if you remember, we talked about levels of analysis, 1970 and 1979 work. They all believe that this about the significance of IGOs, and they say that they have the capacity to erode states' power, because states will have completely controlling certain things, and nowadays these, even if they have lent their, sovereignty to somebody else, or allow them or authorize them, well, these organizations on behalf of states, they can do something. And they said that also many of the, neo-realists, they used to say that some of these organizations since World War II, if you look at it, they've spread around the influence of certain countries. Like in that regard, we in the US have benefited a lot from the activities of many of these organizations. Then there is the liberal school of thought. The liberal school of thought argues that IGOs and the non-state actors, they're kind of challenging the notion of international outcomes of any activity is determined only by states. In other words, they're challenging the traditional spheres of states. And these people from 1960s, they came up with the whole idea of liberalism and international relation is re-emerging. Liberal pluralism is coming out. Let me give you the name of some very important scholars that you should remember. And also, I'm trying to also highlight some factors that, because some students, they write me and they say, oh, Dr. Sadi, there's so much to remember. Could you tell us some of the names that we should? Okay, so in this regard, remember James Rosenau, remember John Burton, and remember, Robert Cohen and Joseph Nye. Okay, these are people I want you to remember in terms of the liberal school of thought. Okay, so the view of the influence of the IGOs, such as United Nations and others, is you know what? The world is changing. Okay. Now, what is another perspective, Marxist perspective? Well, we can say that Marxists and the critical theory people, they're all kind of, generally speaking, they're kind of skeptical of the role that these non-state actors and IGOs can play in international relations. They still think that the economic structure is the dominant force. If the economic structure in the world changes, then things change. Because remember, that was the original Marxist perspective, that the foundation of the society is not culture, is not politics, is economy. Okay? So that was what they thought. And also the Marxist perspective, it suggests that it's the classes and not just necessarily states, because it's the rich classes inside certain states, they have a lot more power and they push them to do certain things. And also, same with MNCs, MNCs, multinationals, is that right? So who owns MNCs? Well, we like to think that in the US, not only the rich, but also a lot of middle class, they own the stocks of it, is that right? But the Marxists, they think that these are also basically owned by certain classes and certain groups. Now, critical theories and the, classical Marxists, they are a little bit different. Because the former that we talked about, they have a tendency to kind of acknowledge a little bit more of what we call human agency. Is that right? The role of humans. Okay. The next notion that we need to talk about is the social constructivism. Is that right? The social constructivism come to this whole notion by saying, you know what? All these other perspectives, the realists, the neo-realists, the liberals, the Marxists, they have all somehow ignored the importance of culture, values, norms. And this is what these guys are emphasizing. Is that right? And some of these ideas, very frankly, comes to political science from sociology. And in fact, some political scientists became political sociologists. Is that right? So the ideas came up over there, and many sociologists believe that institution would basically mold the culture and the individual behavior to the process of, socialization. Okay, so and this one obviously has influenced what international relation thinking, in especially 1990s and everything, and has come all the way to impact and to see a role for something like United Nations. Okay, so the IR theories also influences what social, constructivism. So in that regard, for example, John, Ruggie's book, and work in 1998 talks about the reasons that organizations develop, their own culture is because don't underestimate them. Every organization is going to have their own culture because we are providing with opportunities to do certain functions for us, and then they start growing beyond that. All right. How do we conclude this whole discussion? All right, we can say that, first of all, our theoretical, discussion indicated that there is a very important role for non-state actors. Is that right? And your book really looks, when they say non-state actors, they're looking at any entity which is not a state. And I think maybe there is a little bit of a, interesting dichotomy between the three, authors of our text. And I don't want to get into that because this is not a graduate seminar. This is an undergraduate class. But I want you to be careful the way they use the notion of non-state actors. It's a little bit different from what a typical political scientist talks about non-state actors. They usually refer to either a terrorist group or whatever. But sometimes these guys with the non-state actors, they include multinationals and even some other groups or whatever in it, in that general, very, very large category that they focus on. Okay. They also talk about the whole proliferation of the globalization process, which, as you notice, that's one of the main theme of your book. Is that right? It talks a whole lot about globalization process. And then in that regard, we can, I guess, end our discussion by dividing it into two different perspectives. One is a very positive perspective about this whole notion. It's the liberal perspective that talks about and it sees the evolution, this evolution that they observe for international organization and the world or something, is they see it as a natural phenomenon. That's where we are going naturally. It's not artificial, And this one, according to liberals, eventually is going to erode sovereignty of states. That's their argument. All right. Then there is the realist, the opposite pole. And these people say, well, don't go so fast. It's too early to completely write off states. So, remember, no group of people have complete monopoly over facts. Is that right? They have monopoly over their own opinion. They don't have. So, while we see states are important, we also see that states in many areas, they're not as powerful as sometimes they were before. Is that right? And there are other actors at international level, and that's why we cover them. Is that right? So we can say, both of these groups, to a degree, they have an argument. And I'm going to end it right here. All right? As usual, if you have any kind of question, what do? You ask me. All right? So feel free to contact me by emails and everything, and let me know if there is some particular issue that you didn't get, and I would be more than happy to cover it for you. And if we can't do it by simple email, as always, remember what I told you? You can send me a message, provide a phone number, and then tell me what are the days and times to call you. I write you back and I say, among those options you gave me, I can do this, put it on my calendar, and then I call you. That would be one way. If you like, we have like a face-to-face. Of course, I'm always available through my office hours, and of course, every semester it changes, but here we go. It's listed in our course. And then last but not least, if you're really far away and that's not convenient for you to be on our campus, just remember, I'm always a Zoom link away. So, again, we can make an appointment, and then you can send me a Zoom link, and at that specific day and time, we can have a Zoom session. All right? Take care. Bye-bye.